You remember that in the summer of 2002, we were on the verge of the war in Iraq, and it's just like we're getting beaten down in every way. And this idea came along. You were talking it up. This notion of having a festival where we got together and said, well, yeah, we've taken a lot of hits, but let's
celebrate our victories.
Yeah,
because when we met over in the Wisconsin Dells to discuss this, it was after we had chased Perry out of Wisconsin over to Michigan, and we said, well, why don't we get together and celebrate the victories?
Winning little victories, local victories, but ones that mattered.
Exactly. Yeah. And once we got people together and we talked about it, I don't know who it was. It might have been you. Who knows? Who said, why don't we name this get-together we're going to have every summer after Bob La Follette? And we said, okay, we'll call it Fighting Bob Fest. And that's where it really got started.
That first Fighting Bob Fest back in 2002, really a downtime for progressives in Wisconsin. I remember I came early because I didn't want you to be up there alone. And John Stauber from Center for Media and Democracy and I drove up. We got there early because they're all poor. We got in, there were already people parking cars.
Yeah.
And suddenly you realized that all over Wisconsin, there were these people who thought of themselves as progressives, who understood that La Follette tradition. And as Bob Fest grew every year over the last 10 years, I think that reinforced something, and we saw it come into fruition in February, March, where people, they knew there was a tradition of fighting, they knew there were times when they'd been down, and they thought, that's cool, we'll do it, we'll fight it.
We asked people this year, we said, the pre-registrants, we said, why are you coming to Bob Fest? And I would say 80% of them said, because I want to be uplifted and feel good, and that we can take on these battles. And I think it's really been part of the whole effort, is to
absolutely
tell people, hey, you can have fun, well, we also take on the tough issues.
Well, I think there's one other thing, too, about it, that when you're there with 7, 8, 9, 10,000 people who share your values, share your ideals, maybe don't agree with you on everything, but are kind of this same notion of fighting back, it feels like it's possible.
Yeah.
Bob Fest has always been all volunteers, very grassroots, real people, getting a chance to meet some of their national heroes, Bobby Kennedy Jr. And Bernie Sanders and Jim Hightower, Amy Goodman,
Tom Harkin,
all these great people. But it's also that notion that it does have kind of a freewheeling character to it. You don't always know when everybody's going to show up, but when they do, and when they look out at that crowd of tens of thousands of people,
it turns them on.
Yeah.
I mean, every year we have this. Bernie Sanders or Tom Harkin or one will say, will you come to my state and put on a Bob Fest? Or we'll call it something else, but this kind of a thing. Because I think, again, you have to have something that says to people, we can win.
There's a kind of a yearning to get back to that kind of politics. And it is, and I will say it bluntly, it's a little old-fashioned in this day of cable TV and everything, to get back to the sort of politics that's very human, very personal. Everybody who comes to Bob Fest, there's no star trip. Everybody who comes ends up hanging out in the beer tent. And shaking hands and talking to people.
Phil Donahue just had a knee replacement, as I recall, with a cane and so on, and he arrived, and we got him out of the car and got him up there. And he said, hey, I want to stick around. This is an interesting group.
I'm not leaving. Well, remember Jesse Jackson? I thought he was going to do a stage dive. The crowd, because he was giving this great speech last year, and the crowd was surging up in front of him. I thought he was just going to, dive out into it, but at a certain point, because it was a very warm, very human event.
John, you're talking about some of the people that most people would recognize, Bernie Sanders and Dennis Kucinich. How about Bill McKibbin and what he did when he came to Madison?
Well, Bill McKibbin, was very into all of these sort of popular movements, and we had a wonderful time with him. And as he came up here to talk about sort of his environmental vision and this activist, committed vision that's very responsible, very sane, but yet is willing to take real risks. And I think Bill would be with us this year at Bob Fest. Obviously, somebody who's very into these kinds of ideas and these approaches. But chances are he may be in jail in Washington.
He's taking 50 of our people with him to Washington to get arrested. So,
and that is a part of the Bob Fest thing, isn't it? Because Bob Fest is not just about electoral politics. It's not just saying, oh, we're going to support this candidate or not that candidate. Bob Fest is really about a year-round activism.
Exactly. Because, if you go to a Democratic Party convention or a Republican Party convention for that matter, it's such a sort of structured event, you know, where you have the color guard providing this flag and a Pledge of Allegiance, and then everyone sings and so on and so forth, and all the incumbents give their speeches. You come to Fighting Bob Fest, and most of the people are not aligned with a particular party. I mean, they're not in a party. If you had to choose, of course, they would choose the Democrats over Republicans probably, but for the most part, they're there as progressives who are saying, let us decide what we can do, and let's do it.
And I think even a pretty radical progressive. It's not an unapologetic progressivism. Right. And it's funny, at Bobfest over the years, we've had the Libertarian candidate for governor, Tommy Thompson's brother Ed. We've had Ron Paul backers out there in big numbers. We've had Greens. We've had Green candidates for president speak. We've had Democratic candidates for president speak.
Socialists.
Socialists. We've had, and so it is, what I like about Bobfest is it's sort of the big house of progressivism, the big house of a radical and challenging politics that says that most of what you see on TV, most of what you hear on the radio, most of what you read in the newspaper is an insufficient politics.
Yeah. In some ways, I think of Granny D. Haddock as sort of the soul of Fighting Bobfest. When she came to the first Fighting Bobfest, it was hard for her to talk into this huge crowd in Baraboo. But she really laid it on the line in terms of what progressives have to do. And she said, you know, if you can't take action, then go home. I'm sick and tired of people saying, I can't do this or I can't do that. And I thought she did just a marvelous job.
I think that's, and you know, it's funny. The other part about Bobfest is that while the speeches are rousing and energetic, and you have a Jesse Jackson, you have a Granny D, you have a Jim Hightower, who's been an absolutely loyal person, they also have a lot of depth. There are speakers who come there to make major statements. And I always think of Bernie Sanders as, you know, he doesn't get up there just to do a rip-roaring, rabble-rousing speech, although he gets a lot of applause. He comes to make serious statements about the economy.
And to get people involved in that process. I think that's part of the magic. Well, as we look at this Fighting Bobfest coming up, one of the questions has been, where are people now with respect to President Obama? And are they disappointed in him? And having Cornel West come to Fighting Bobfest is kind of an interesting dynamic in and of itself. What's your sense right now as to how people are feeling about national politics as opposed to local?
I'd be very blunt. I think people are very disappointed in Barack Obama. And I think that some of that disappointment is their own fault, because there are people who expected Obama to do everything.
Right.
And no president ever has been able to. I cover politics for a living, so I remember when there were Republicans who were disappointed in Ronald Reagan before they made him a saint. And so Obama came in with incredibly high expectations. But especially at an event like Bobfest, you see the people who are willing themselves to go out and make great sacrifices and fight very, very hard to achieve progressive ends. And I think an awfully lot of them do ask, why isn't our president fighting harder?
One of the things that I'll never forget is when Bobby Kennedy was going to speak, and one of the nuns from the home where his aunt was staying for many, many years called me over and said, would you tell Bobby that his aunt is over here? And it's the first time she'd been in public in her life.
Since the 60s.
She died a few weeks later, but Bobby just raced over there and talked with her. And it kind of set the tone for what was happening. I mean, it's as if he shifted gears, and suddenly he was not just he was not giving a political speech. It was part of something much bigger than that.
That may, you know, it was Bobby Kennedy Jr.'s speech. It was in 2004.
Yeah,
I believe. It may well have been one of the most remarkable moments, because you did have John Kennedy's sister.
Right.
You know, Bobby Kennedy, the father's sister, there, and she's lived in Wisconsin. She lived in Wisconsin most of her adult life, at a home for folks with some difficulties. But yeah, that was an incredibly magical moment, because you had all this connection, all this history. But the funny thing is, I've seen it at other moments too. I was blown away I remember after New Orleans, after Hurricane Katrina. Bobfest occurred just a matter of days,
right,
when they were still going live from Katrina.
Right.
Amy Goodman, who was supposed to be at Bobfest that year, couldn't make it,
right,
because she was down in New Orleans. And I remember as speakers spoke about New Orleans and what had happened, and George Bush and Dick Cheney's neglect of that place.
right.
I remember the incredible passion that was in play there. And you're right, Bobfest is not an angry event. Usually it's a very optimistic event. But that day people were angry. and they were frustrated with a government that had so failed people. And it's funny because here you are in Wisconsin, a long way from New Orleans. Here you are with an overwhelmingly white audience, and yet these are people whose brothers and sisters, whose fellow Americans were suffering. And I remember the passion there. I remember when we took the buckets out to raise money to support groups that were doing work down in New Orleans, and people just emptied their pockets. And that is one of the beautiful things about BobFest, is that people come there, they want to learn things, they want to hear things, but they also want to get involved.
They want to get involved, they want to be inspired.
Yeah.
Yeah. Inspire me. Okay, well, that's what we're going to do.
Tell us what to do. Let's
if
go
Bernie
do it.
Sanders and Jim Hightower can't inspire them, they're probably comatose.
Well, that's a big part of it, but there's another element too. I think that Bernie Sanders, Jim Hightower, Tammy Baldwin, a congresswoman from Wisconsin, Russ Feingold, who's spoken there over the years, I think all of these people, when they go back to Washington or wherever they're at, I think they keep in their head, wow.
Well, I find when I'm traveling around,
Yeah.
people will say, hey, tell me about BobFest. I mean, because they want to know what happened.
Well, it's something that wow, there's thousands of people out there that have got my back.
Right.
And that, I don't doubt for a second, I think Bernie would say it, that gives you a lot more confidence when you stand up in Washington to even a president. So I think BobFest does a lot of good, and but I do know I know one thing for sure. Neither of us are smart enough to have believed it would have lasted 10 years.
That's for sure. I mean, after the first one, I was just delighted that it happened. The second one was bigger, and the third one was bigger, and the fourth one was bigger, and it's been bigger every year. Now we're moving to the Coliseum. Mm-hmm. It's going to be a huge event, and I think what happened in the streets in Madison in February and March helps to feed the excitement of what's going to happen at Fighting BobFest.
I think there's no question of that, and one of these days, we'll just take BobFest to Washington and take over the whole thing.
Hey, let's do it.
Okay, good to see you, brother.